When it comes to the development of the African continent, there are many issues that remain very important. And in my opinion, the problem is to be able to actually sort them out in terms of priority. Which issue should actually come first, or which category of issues should actually come first, and why? The reason why I'm asking this is because of this very interesting international movement called Correct the Map that is actually being led by two advocacy groups called Africa No Filter and Speak Up Africa. And the particularity of this movement is that it's actually being backed by the African Union. That's very surprising, knowing the number, of public interest, fights that have been, currently undergoing in Africa, and that currently also lacking a lot of support from the African Union. The objective of this episode, as you notice, is to look at the particularity of the Correct the Map movement, try and understand what it is really about, and why does it enjoy the support of the African Union. And lastly, the idea is to look at whether that public or that form of international support from the African Union is actually relevant to the African, context when it comes to development of this very interesting continent. Again, we will definitely, take a time to reflect upon this very interesting movement so that at the end of this episode, we are all able to formulate our own position and our own opinion when it comes to that kind of initiative, on the ground. Welcome to your very interesting development podcast, Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African Talks. My name is S.I.K.A, and I'm the founder and the presenter of this very interesting, pod platform. If this is the first time, well, here we talk about development and the most critical issues regarding how best the African continent will actually gain all the necessary tools, to foster and promote economic and development growth within the entire continent. So if this is something that resonates with you, you are definitely welcome. All you have to do is to click on the subscribe button and to activate the ring bell, and you will be sorted. Now, before we delve into the development of our very interesting episode, it is very important that I provide you with the context. I give you a bit of background. So the first question I'm going to try and answer is regarding what is the Correct the Map movement. Well, simply put, it's an international, movement led by two advocacy group called Africa No Filter and Speak Up Africa. According to these groups, the African continent is currently being misrepresented on the global map. What they're trying to say is that the current size of the African continent that we all see on the global map is not actually the real size. In reality, Africa is bigger than what it looks like. In reality, Africa is bigger, way bigger than what it's actually, being presented to us. And the origin of the problem is actually based on the type or on the kind of projection that, we are currently using. And what's the name of this projection? Well, it's called the Mercator projection. The Mercator projection is a projection that was created by a Flemish cartographer called Mercator. And the main idea behind the designing of this cartography was to make sure that it might, or it should be, or it would be actually helpful to sailors when they were navigating the oceans. And when we take a look at this very interesting projection, we notice that the African continent looks smaller than Greenland in terms of sizing, and it also looks smaller than the US or the EU or even, some other region in the world. But in reality, Africa is actually 14 times bigger than Greenland. In reality also, Africa can actually fit the US, China, the EU, India, and still have some, consequent lands available. In reality, also, Africa is about 20% of the Earth's size. So it is actually safe to say that the continent represents 1/5, of the Earth. And this is a very, considerable size, to actually like keep in mind. Therefore, the accurate representation of the African continent should actually be a global, or international concern. Well, I think speaking of international concern, this very interesting movement is actually enjoying a very interesting support, which is the reason why I decided to make this episode. I do understand the rationale, and I personally believe that representation matters. Representation is very important, especially when you are a continent that, has been for years, for centuries, constantly being undermined in terms of, global contribution, to economic development, to trade development, to even political, historical, and sociological development. We all remember this very, famous saying from French former President Nicolas Sarkozy, saying that the problem of Africa is that it did not contribute enough to the history of the world. Of course, this is a false statement. This is a statement that actually displays your level or the level of misinformation and the level, of little, culture when it comes to, like general knowing of Africa, and also particular and specific, knowledge with regard to African story and African culture. But that's not, the objective of this episode. My concern here is that this movement, Correct the Map, may sound relevant. It may sound interesting because, again, we need to have a proper representation of Africa, at any instances, whether it is political instances, whether it is economic instances, whether it is social, whether it is also even, geographical instances, we need to have the proper representation. But remember, at the introduction or in the beginning of this episode, I said when you are a developing, continent like Africa, it's very important to prioritize your issues and to prioritize also your fights. It's very important to make sure to highlight or to know exactly which fight or which issue, should actually come first. And I'm going to share a very interesting recording, of the African Union, backing up this very interesting claim. And we will definitely, comment on that.
The African Union supports this campaign and sees that this campaign, through various actions aimed at promoting this really accurate mapping and addressing historical inaccuracies. So, being closely aligned with the AU broader goals of reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage, challenging false narrative, and promoting a more accurate and equitable representation of the continent, this campaign really aligns with several actions that are directly or indirectly linked to the campaign but supports its broader objective.
The AU will push for a wider adoption of the map and discuss collective actions with member states. The campaign states it has sent a formal request to the UN geospatial body. A UN spokesperson said that once received, it must be reviewed and approved by a committee of experts.
Well, now, from what we just heard, we can identify actually three arguments that actually explains the backing up, from the African Union. The first one is because the Correct the Map movement addresses historical inaccuracies. Second, it also aligns with broader goals of reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. And third, it helps challenging false narrative. Now, these arguments are very interesting and they are very important. They are all valid. Do not get me wrong. They are all valid. But I personally believe that when you are a very strategic and such an important organization like the African Union, you need to pick your battle. You need to choose your battles based on some rational element, based on some rational indicators, but also based on some achievable objective. The reason why I say that is because if you have to explain to a layman, or a very, like normal African individual, a person who's struggling, every day to actually make, or to actually like earn the minimum revenue, a person who's struggling to actually even live with like $5 a day, and you're going to that person and you're saying that, well, we are the African Union and we have been created, by the way, to actually, like protect your interest, make sure that, like Africa, like enjoys the proper recognition that it needs from the world. Well, we decided, in 2025 to actually fight for a movement that is actually aiming at correcting the map of Africa on the global stage. Well, in your opinion, if you were that person, what would you respond to the African Union? What I'm trying to say here is that as a strategic organization and institution, it is very important to not just cherry pick your battles because it will help you make, the headlines. You have to choose your battles because they will definitely have a strong and direct impact, and also an indirect impact when it comes to improving the economic condition of your citizen, when it also coming to improving the financial, the social, and even the historical, condition of your citizen. There are, in my opinion, many other issues in Africa that should deserve your attention. There are many other situations in Africa that could have also, benefit from such a public, show of support. Let me give you a very interesting example. First of all, it is of public knowledge that every year, millions of Africans, especially young Africans from 18 to 35, sometimes to 40, are applying for student permits, student visas. They are applying for business visas. They are applying for entrepreneurship visas. And in most instances, sometimes with no reasons, with no explanation, many visa applications got denied. And Africans, young people, no longer have the opportunity to go and study abroad. This situation is a situation that should actually call the interest of the African Union. This situation is a situation that should deserve the utmost attention from, or the utmost attention of the African Union authorities. But what do we see currently? I don't know. I don't know if this ever been, a topic of debate, at the African Union. But the reality is that foreign embassies are making billions of dollars, a year out of visa application. And when we're looking at the success rate, or when we're looking at, the rejection rate with proper and rational explanation, that rate is literally, non-existent. We clearly have no information because Africans do not even have the right, to understand why their visa application are getting rejected. Another very interesting point that I would like to mention is when we're talking about, like challenging false narrative, and when we're also talking about aligning with broader goals of reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Well, these are arguments that I personally respect, and these are arguments that I personally value. But my question is, in addition to correcting the map and making sure that the global perception of Africa is actually correct, what about also changing our current education system in Africa? Because many of what we're learning in Africa, like the Mercator projection, is also, like the result of international influence. And if we are actually, embarking on this very interesting journey of representation matters, what about making sure that also our education curricula are actually, like realistic? Our education curricula are actually, portraying Africa and making sure that our children our little brothers and sisters are actually learning what they should learn from this continent. These are also, a very interesting, topic. These are very interesting issues and pressing issues that should deserve the interest, of the African Union, that should also be publicly supported and backed by this very strategic, again, and very important institution. So, in my opinion, correct the map movement is not a wrong initiative. It's a good and it's a very cool initiative. But if for a specific reason we're talking about, limited means to make sure that the African Union could actually foster African interest within Africa and outside Africa, well, if I was the head of the African Union, I would definitely, steer my support or the institutional support towards, more pressing issues. Because yes, let's imagine that we're now moving from the Mercator projection to this new projection called Equal Earth Map. Well, now we will have a correct and a proper, representation of Africa on the map. And then the next question is, so what? What's going to happen? What's going to happen, for the regular African citizen struggling, to earn even $2 a day? What is going to happen for, our little brothers and little sisters, our children, who are going to school, to primary school and to high school? How exactly this will affect, their education, capacity and capabilities? How exactly this is going to improve and make sure that they are being properly equipped with the rightful skills to make sure that in the next 10 to 50 years, they are going to be, like the main driver of change and development in Africa? These are relevant questions we should ask. And my concern here is that it is fine when movements like the correct maps, are actually being led and, being supported by the private sector or non-governmental organization, such as, Africa No Filter and Africa Speak Up. Personally, I think it is okay. But when this kind of movement are going or are actually about to enjoy, institutional support, we need to make sure that, all the means that are going to be deployed will actually be able to serve, public interest and the global interest. And right now, when it comes to the representation of Africa, priority should not be towards, like imagery, or priority should not be toward like making sure that we're changing, the global projection. Well, this again might actually sound good, but in my opinion, it does not really, like have a strong impact, because right now we do have the youngest population, in the world, and we are the second, most populated continent in the world. But when we're looking at the potential of our young people, the potential of young Africans, every day, young Africans, are actually struggling. They are fighting to access opportunities. They are struggling to have access to the better educational system. They're struggling to also have access to the better healthcare and health institutional system. So to me, these are concerns and these are movements, that should enjoy the African Union. The proper movement should be to correct the education system, to correct the health system, to correct the economic system, to correct the banking system, to correct the financial system, to correct, even the entrepreneurial system. And yes, to have the backing, of the African Union and making sure that these global voices that are actually fighting to make and to actually like make development a reality in Africa enjoy the proper support and become and enjoys also the proper reputation they deserve. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and I hope you actually learn anything interesting. I'm also happy to learn about your position. What do you think about, this correct the map movement? What do you think about, the position of the African Union? And do you agree with my analysis or not? Let me know. And thank you for your time. Thank you for your support. Thank you for listening to your favorite development podcast, Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African Talks, the only podcast where strong realities meet powerful perspectives. À bientôt.